It's all about Jesus, his sinless life as both fully God and fully man, his death on a cross, and his resurrection that triumphed over death forever. But how does the gospel speak to issues like justice, adoption, disability, gratitude, growth, and generosity? How do we act in line with the truth of the gospel? How are we following the gospel line?
Well, good morning, NorthPoint. So good to see you this morning. And I am excited. I'm so excited to talk to you about disability today, and I'm also nervous. I'm excited with this to be able to help us learn together, to be able to see and to affirm persons with disabilities. And I'm nervous also because it's a sensitive topic and one that affects many people very deeply. It's something that's also very misunderstood. And it's misunderstood in a number of ways. Disability is misunderstood cognitively, how we see disabilities, how we think about them. It's misunderstood relationally, as in how do I engage with persons with disabilities? And so for many people that are non-disabled persons, you pull back and we just decide, well, I'm just not gonna do that because I don't wanna make a mistake. And so relationally, I think sometimes we struggle with this. And then theologically, I'm just not sure we really know what God says about it. What is a theology of disability? How does Jesus speak to this? If we did a quiz this morning, and I ask every one of you that are here to do a few simple things, to define disability, to provide examples of disability, and to write a short theology of disability, I'm not sure that we would score very well on that quiz. But does that mean that we should all just feel terrible about ourselves, tuck our tails between our legs and go home? No. That's not Jesus's way. I think what Jesus wants us to do is to learn together. That together we can grow our understanding of disability. We can understand engaging a little bit better with persons with disabilities and see how Jesus thinks about all of this. You know, if you're here this morning and you have a disability, do you know how Jesus sees you? Do you know what Jesus is continually speaking to you? And maybe you have a sense of it, but I wonder if you've ever heard your church talk about it and affirm to you what God says about you. And so I so want you to hear this today, but even more than that, I want you to hear what Jesus is saying to you. We just sang that song, I will speak the name of Jesus, and now Jesus wants to speak to you, and he wants to say some things to you. So here's what I want us to do today. I want us to start with a basic understanding of disability, and then we'll see what Jesus has to say about it. And I'm going to give you quite a bit of information. So if you're a learner and you like to learn, or you ever take notes and you like to take notes, this would be a day that you could take notes or you could take screenshots when the different screens are up there. But I've got a lot of things that are going to come at you pretty quickly, and then we're going to get to what Jesus has to say about this. We need to start really with defining what disability is. And in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was installed in the 1990, it defined disability this way. Disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And so when you think about disability, there's really three, this is a legal definition, but there's three primary elements of a disability. First, there's an impairment, or there is a limitation of the body or of the mind, which keeps someone from major life activities. So it's a limitation that keeps you from walking, or seeing, or hearing, or self-care, or problem solving. So there's activity limitation, or it could keep you from participation in work, or participation in social relationships, or participation in recreation. So there's an impairment, there's activity limitation, and participation restrictions. Well, what are some specific examples of disabilities? In the IDEA, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, 13 categories are outlined for disabilities. But we could take those 13 and really summarize those in 4 headings: behavioral emotional disabilities, sensory disabilities, physical disabilities, and developmental disabilities. Okay, what are some examples in each of those categories? Behavioral emotional disabilities would be ADHD or OCD, anxiety and eating disorders, or mental illness. Sensory disabilities would be deafness and blindness. Those are the 2 primary ones we think about, but individuals could also have a disability with smell, or with touch, or with taste. And then there's physical disabilities: cerebral palsy, stroke, arthritis, epilepsy, and lastly, developmental disabilities like autism. Learning disabilities fall into the developmental category, and things like dyslexia. Now, often individuals will have a combination of these disabilities. In fact, one of the categories in the IDEA is for multiple disabilities. And then many disabilities, they don't necessarily just fit into one category. And there's continuing scholarly research and discussions about how to exactly categorize disabilities. So for example, autism has been typically placed in the developmental disability category. But if you think about someone that has autism, or you have autism, that often also impacts the behavioral, sensory, and physical aspects of living as well. Okay, well, if this is what disability is, and these are some examples, how does disability happen? Where do disabilities come from? And there's three primary causes, or three causes of disability: birth, illness, and accident. Either individuals are born with a disability and you deal with it throughout your life. Now, we should state this, is that sometimes it's readily obvious from birth what that disability will be. But a number of disabilities need to be diagnosed, and they present themselves a little bit later on in life. You would not know that a baby has dyslexia. It would take some time to come to understand that. And often we still live in a society that does not diagnose dyslexia very well or very early. And it takes some time to be able to see that and understand that. But birth is one cause. Illness can be another cause of disability. You develop an autoimmune disease. A COVID-produced disability for some individuals. Multiple sclerosis would be an illness that produces in some individuals a disability. And then lastly, an accident. Perhaps an accident where you lose a limb or you become paralyzed. Now, when we think about these causes of disability, it can help us with at least a baseline level of empathy and understanding for those who deal with disabilities. First of all, because it's not a chosen situation. Individuals are not choosing to be born this way or to get ill or to be in an accident and choosing this disability that they have. But secondly, most of us are disabled, at least in a temporary way, at some point in our lives, right? Whether it's through illness or through an accident. And when I realize that, it can help me have some level of understanding, a small level, but a level of understanding for what those with long-term disabilities are dealing with every day of their lives. Now, I want to be careful here, because that's not to say that if you've had to, roll around on one of those knee scooters for a month, that you understand what it's like to live with a long-term disability. I don't mean that. But it can give you a little bit of an understanding of, hey, these are things that people are dealing with all of the time in their experience. I've shared with you before that I have a couple of herniated discs in my back. And so when I'm doing well and doing my exercise and not doing too much rigorous physical activity, I'm typically okay. But every once in a while, I get lazy or I step out of those bounds, and then my back will go out. And so like a number of you, I've had periods of time where I've been laying in bed for days at a time and I can barely move. Any movement causes severe pain. And in those moments, like when I'm like, I got to go to the restroom, I'm like, this is going to be about a 30-minute process and it's going to be a lot of pain. And that's what it's like. And some of you have that situation as well. During COVID, did anybody get COVID brain fog? I remember the first time that I got COVID, I was about 3 or 4 days into it, and I'm sitting down at my desk in my bedroom. I still remember where I was at. And I'm not like the smartest person in the world, but I'm decent at learning and things like that. And so I'm sitting down at my desk, and I am trying to get a thought from my head onto a piece of paper. I'm just trying to make a task list. And I could not write anything on the piece of paper. And I sat there frozen and got incredibly frustrated because I just could not connect it from my head to my hand and write it down on paper. And after that, I thought, you know what, this is the kind of thing that some individuals deal with every single day of their lives. This is what they're going through. So again, I don't mean to say that, okay, if you have something like that happened to you, you get it. You don't fully get it, but a little bit, some level of understanding and empathy in that situation. Lamar Hardwick is a pastor. He calls himself the autism pastor, and he writes on disability. And this is one thing he said: people with disabilities live in a world that is not designed for them. When you think about the world that we live in, the world has been designed typically by able-bodied people for able-bodied people, right? And it's only been since the ADA and the IDEA in 1990 that changes began to be made to address accessibility issues and inclusion issues for persons with disabilities. Well, how many people are in this? How many people are dealing with disabilities? 26% of adults in the United States have a disability. That's from 2022, which means 1 in 4 adults, more than 1 in 4 adults deal with a disability. And 15% of students ages 3 through 21 were enrolled in special education programs in 2021. That's over 7 million students that are in special education programs. Let me bring this up maybe down a little closer to home. I'd love for you to think about your family right now. Most of us either deal with a disability ourselves, we have a family member with a disability, or you have an extended family member with a disability. There are few people that are unaffected by disability in some way. I mentioned you have had a few acute seasons of disability that are relatively short-lived, but within my family, as I was going through this and I was thinking about it, I was like, we actually hit all 4 of the categories of disability within my own family. And I imagine that if you think back and you think about your relationships, you'll see that disability is closer to home than you typically realize. For some people, they don't have to imagine what that is like because their everyday experience is affected by disability as they live in a world that is not designed for them. So if this is disability, what does God have to say about this? How does he look at it? How does he see it? And what does he have for us and for our church? Because most of us deal with this in some way. Many of you deal with it every day. And I wonder if we've considered what God has to say to us, how he views you, how he views disability, and how he wants us to think about it. So in view of our series from the book of Galatians, just a quick recap. This is what we've been seeing in Galatians, is that the gospel is the good news that comes from God is that every individual, every person can have a relationship with God, not on the basis of our works, not on the basis of where we come from, what we have done, what we haven't done, but how does Paul say we come into a relationship with God? We come in by grace through faith. We're not justified by our performance, whether the performance is good or bad. We're not justified by the church we go to. We're not made right with God by that. We're made right by faith in Jesus Christ alone. And we come to a relationship with God. We know God through faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But then this is what we've seen. When we get clear on that, we come to God by grace through faith in Jesus. There is a line that flows from that relationship, that gospel good news relationship, into everything we do and everything we think and everything we practice in our lives. In other words, the grace that saves us is the grace that radically transforms everything about us. One way to see that is that as we grow in this gospel and gospel line, we become passionate about the things God is passionate about. And one of the things that God is passionate about is he is passionate about caring for persons with disabilities. I want you to see this from Galatians, and start in Galatians chapter 3. So if you have a Bible, take it and turn to Galatians chapter 3. 3 things that God and Paul have for us on disability. If you don't have a Bible, it's on page 944, and the Bible is there in front of you. We'll start in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 26. We've seen this already, but let's recap. Verse 26, so in Christ Jesus, Paul says, you are all children of God through, say it together, faith. Children of God through faith in Jesus Christ. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. So again, one more time, we come into relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. But then what are we coming into? What's happening here for all of us that have trusted in Jesus Christ as we come together? That's verse 28. In this place, in God's family, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. There's neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one, diversity with unity in Jesus Christ, which means God does not discriminate based on culture, class, or gender. We could add to this today and apply it to our day. He does not discriminate on the basis of whether or not you have a disability. What brings every single person into the family of God? Faith in Jesus Christ alone. Now, that doesn't mean that we ignore or act like distinctions don't exist. But none of the distinctions are the basis of how God treats people. In his family, we're one, having all come to him the same way. So that our primary identity, above all other identities, is that we collectively together are children of God. And if that's how God sees us, then that's how we see each other. Now, right, still in this church, in the first century church that Paul was talking to, there were Jews and Gentiles within the church. Paul addresses that. There were males and there were females. In his culture, there were slaves and there were free people, and they all come together in that church. And Paul says, above all, we're sons and daughters of God, together through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, one of the foundations of this teaching from Paul comes from a belief at the very beginning of the Bible that every single person has been created in the image of God. That we are all created in God's image. Now, there are certain religious traditions that really like to emphasize the moral depravity of all human beings. You're all sinners, you're all terrible, you're all horrible, you're all going to hell. The lot of you are absolutely horrible in every possible way. You're disgusting to God. Have you been around that kind of teaching and theology? Now look, let me say this. If you were to read the Bible, you're going to come to see that the Bible says we are all sinners. Like the Bible directly says that. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But do you know something else that was true about you before you were ever a sinner? The first thing that is true about you is that you are created in the image of God, with incredible worth and value, since you have been created in God's image. God loves you. He created you. He made you that way before you were ever a sinner. All human beings that have been created. But you know that also means something else. I'm created in the image of God. I have incredible worth and value because of that, but it also means that I and that you, that everyone has a contribution to make to God's world. And through faith in Jesus Christ to God's church, we all have value to make a contribution. God is the creator God. And if you turn to the first pages of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2, God is creating stuff, and he's creating order out of chaos, and he's putting things in a structured way, and he's creating beauty, and he's making the world flourish. And then at the pinnacle of his creation, he makes man and woman in his image, the only part of his creation in his image, as the creator God, and in you he puts some design of creativity so that you can have a contribution to the world that he has created and that he has put you in unique ways. So look, go back to Galatians chapter 3. This is forming a basis of Paul's understanding of what he's teaching here. While individual distinctions are good, I'm not even going to say, well, they're not bad. No, they're better than not bad. They're good. Your distinctions are good. Your culture, your ethnicity, your gender, your personality type, and your specific gifts and abilities, and even your limitations, that's a part of who you are, created in the image of God. But in Jesus, we all come together in an amazing collection of diversity that celebrates our common faith in Jesus, that celebrates our new identity in Jesus Christ as sons and daughters of God, and celebrates our unique contributions to the family of God. We all have a part in God's family because we're all made in God's image, and we have come in by faith in Jesus Christ, including persons with disabilities. And so here's the first point. Took a little while to get to it, but here it is. Persons with disabilities are created in the image of God, having great worth and contribution to the family of God. It took a while to get to, but it's like the longest point I've ever had before. So you got to get a lot in there, right? Every single person, and I'm just calling out persons with disabilities because that's what we're talking about. We could just say every person is created in the image of God and has great worth and contribution to the family of God. Again, we should not deny that there is distinction between Jews and Gentiles, males and females, in the first century, slaves and free people. Those are clear distinctions. And we shouldn't deny that there is a distinction between someone with a disability and a non-disabled person. That would be contrary to reality. there's kind of a movement in our culture to get rid of every distinction between men and women, every distinction between just persons in every possible way, and yet that is contrary to even the physical eye and to reality. And ultimately, it would diminish and hurt both the person with a disability and non-disabled persons. It would deny diversity. A part of the beauty of Jesus' church is all the diversity that comes together unified as sons and daughters of God, with God as our Father. But what we also have to recognize as we say that is that persons with disability are fully human, created in God's image with incredible worth and value, like everyone, responsible to contribute with what God has given them, like everyone, but also, lastly, sinners in need of God's grace, like everyone. Now, we have to clear up something and make sure we're clear about this. This does not mean that persons with disabilities are disabled because of their sin, or their sin caused them to be disabled. I love it that Jesus directly addresses this in John chapter 9 and sets all of first century and still some modern day understanding on its head. He's walking along with his disciples. A couple of his disciples see a man that is blind, and they say to Jesus, "Jesus, tell us, was it this man or was it his parents who sinned to cause this to happen?" And Jesus probably looked at them and was like, "What are you talking about?" But he knew what they were thinking, because that's what everybody in first century culture thought, that you're in this situation because of your sin, or it's a generational curse upon you because of your parents' sin. And Jesus says, neither. It happened so the works of God could be displayed. You're thinking the wrong way about this, which means we cannot assume direct causation between personal sin and disability. In fact, Jesus tells us you should typically assume the opposite is true, that there is no direct causation between personal sin and disability. And I wonder if some parents and caretakers that are here today, you really need to hear that truth. You maybe wondered if God is like punishing you, or if he's out to make life really hard for you because you did something wrong. No. He's not doing that to you. That's not how God works. He is there in your struggle, and he has a plan for you, though it's difficult. He is not punishing you. I had a woman come up to me after the service, and she said, I don't think I've met her before. Her name was Lisa, and she just said to me, hey, it's going to be brief. I just got to tell you, I needed to hear you say that this morning. 2 kids that have disabilities, and she's like, I know that's true, but I just have never heard it spoken, and I didn't realize how much it was shaping the way I'm thinking about my life right now, to realize God is not punishing me. If you're here today and you have a disability, it is not because you did something before you were before you were even outside of the womb, or God was looking down the corridor of time and he said, well, I know you're going to be a fool, so I'm just going to get you right before you were born. God did not do that. That's not how he works. Who sinned, this man or his parents? Neither, Jesus said. That's not how this works. So disability is not the result of personal sin. There are some rare exceptions to that. I'm the pastor here, one of the pastors here at the church, and if I decide that after this weekend, I've had a long weekend, I'm going to go get high and get drunk and drive my car, and I run into a tree, and I become disabled, and I become paralyzed because I did that, you could probably see a pretty direct causation there, right? You could make the connection. Maybe I scared some of you when I said that. I'm not planning to do that, by the way, just FYI, nor have I done that in the past before, just to maybe I should think of a better illustration. But you could see, okay, that's a direct causation, but that's an exception. That's not typical. And even in a situation like that some of you maybe have found yourselves in, where you're kind of paying the penalty for a personal choice you made, there is still grace from Jesus. There's always grace. There's always forgiveness there. However, so one more time, disability, please hear this, is not the result of personal sin. However, to be fully human means we have a capacity to sin. And so persons with disabilities can sin. There is not a special reserved category of humanity where persons with disabilities get a free pass to say, to do, or to be whatever they want to be. Part of being fully human is being made in the image of God and being sinful. It may seem a little bit harsh maybe to say that persons with disabilities are sinners, but their parents know that this is true, and people that are around them know that this is true. And more than that, it diminishes their humanity to say that they're not. There is a certain dignity to holding people responsible for themselves and look at them and say, hey, you're capable. With God's grace and God's, you are capable of learning. You're capable of listening and growing and trusting and obeying God. There is a dignity to the full humanity of that. Now, for persons with disabilities, that may look a little different than it looks for other people. And society and the church even is still working on accommodations and accessibility and things like learning models. But we believe in the full humanity of all peoples. The image of God, worth, contribution, opportunity to trust Jesus and grow in him and overcome sin. Which leads to the second thing we see in Galatians. Disability can be a strength. Disability can be a strength. Stick with me. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul describes how he originally got to Galatia and started this church. And he indicates that he wasn't planning to go there, but God had other ideas for him. It was through a terrible illness that Paul ended up in Galatia. Maybe even this illness Paul got, it might have even disfigured him in a significant way. Look at Galatians chapter 4 and verse 13 as he describes this. He says, as you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. And even though my illness was a trial to you, you didn't treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself. Where then is your blessing of me now? I can testify that if you could have done so, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. Now, what Paul is doing here is he's making an argument to the Galatians about how when he first came to them and started the church there, they accepted him. They accepted his gospel message. They welcomed him. They were very gracious to him in welcoming him. But now they've turned away from him and they're following those false teachers and they're giving up the gospel that Paul preached to them. And Paul's like, hey, remember how you loved me at the first? Let's go back to that. Would you mind going back to that and receive the gospel again and love me the way you loved me at first? And yet in the midst of this argument, he gives us some insight into a difficult illness that he had. Now, again, before we get to that, understand something. In the first century did not have the language of disability like we have it now. Every illness or condition in the first century was seen through a spiritual/medical lens. They thought all bad conditions were the result of personal sin and that you have not appeased your God. You did something to make your God upset, so it's your fault. All you can do is hope for a cure, hope for a healing, hope for deliverance. And so if you're living in that kind of culture, you can imagine why there's not a lot of accommodations. There's not a lot of inclusion. There's not a lot of accessibility because if you're blind, if you're lame, if you're a leper, it's your fault. And you are looked down upon and you are cast out of society. So in our day, all three of those elements of disability would apply to people in the first century who are blind, lame, or had some form of disability. They have a limitation. It limits their activity. It limits their participation in society in general. So think about this mindset. This is a big deal then when Paul comes to Galatia and they see him in the midst of his illness as a messenger from God in spite of his condition. Now, we don't know what that condition was exactly, but based on what Paul says in verse 15 about eyes, when he says to them, you would have torn out your eyes for me, many have surmised that Paul had a debilitating eye condition. Maybe a severe glaucoma or blindness that limited him. We do know from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that Paul had what he called a thorn in the flesh that he prayed for God to remove from him 3 times. Notice what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Here we have a disabled apostle. One of the primary men that we look to that have given us the scriptures, that has given God's truth to us, one of the main guys God used to advance his kingdom had a disability. And he asked God to take it away, and God said to him, no, Paul, you're going to be better off with this disability. In fact, Paul, for you specifically, you need this disability. And we can imagine why Paul needed this disability. Do you remember what Paul was like? before he followed Jesus? Guy was an arrogant, I almost said this first service, I almost said it again, son of a gun, but that's what comes to mind. He was an arrogant, cocky dude killing Christians, right? And that's his personality. That's like built into him to achieve, to perform, to be better than everybody else, to look down on everybody else. Jesus gets a hold of him, and I don't know that that's just completely going to go away. And Paul tells us specifically, in order to keep me from being conceited, I don't know if we would know who Paul is or ever really heard about him if God had not given him this disability. That's what Paul says. I had these incredible revelations from God. I entered up into heaven. Jesus appeared to me, and to keep me from becoming conceited about that. At least for Paul, he was given a thorn in the flesh. And God says, Paul, you need this to keep you humble, to keep you resting in my strength and in my grace. And then Paul goes on to say this in verses 9 and 10. He says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. That's why, for Christ's sake, I can delight in weaknesses, insults, hardships, and persecutions and difficulties. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Disability can be a strength. Disability can be a strength. That doesn't mean you need to ask for one. I would not suggest you put that on your prayer list, that you need to ask for that. It doesn't mean that disabilities are easy. Do you notice the words Paul uses? Hardships, difficulties, insults. They're just that. But God has this amazing way of working through limitations and weaknesses and disabilities to do apparently to do his greatest work that he does. I was reading through this passage as I was getting ready for this message and studying, and as I was reading it, someone particular came to my mind, and tears just came to my eyes as I thought about them, and I thought about the hardship and the difficulty, the sorrow. There can be a sorrow with disability and loss, and at the same time, incredible hope and encouragement that Jesus is there working in the beautiful humanity of persons with disabilities. Do you know that in one famous passage, Jesus actually declares that disability could be a cure for sin? That disability could even help an individual avoid hell? Matthew chapter 5, this is part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says this, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Is this hyperbole? Probably it is. Hyperbole, yes. Jesus was not expecting the entire crowd that he was speaking to immediately leave and start mass amputations, across the camp. That's not what he's looking for. But I think what he's trying to do here is, in a society that looked down on the blind and the lame and blamed them for their condition, Jesus says that condition is preferable, and some of you should probably even pursue it if it enables you to follow me and care more deeply about spiritual things. Jesus says disability can be a strength, it can be a help, it can be a hard blessing. Jesus presents here a positive view of disability. It would have been mind-boggling to his first century listeners. I don't even know if they could process what he was saying here. And they might be very literal. You want us to go cut our hands off? No, he's not really telling you to cut your hands off. What he's doing is elevating persons with disabilities, showing their value. And perhaps this is a view that we need to consider more fully. In a society where seeing and hearing and speaking verbally and learning at a particular pace and being able to care for oneself is normalized, in that society is blindness, being in a wheelchair, deafness, being nonverbal, having a learning disability, is it challenging? Yes. Is it painful? Yes. Does it feel exhausting sometimes? I imagine so. Do you feel alone at times? But can you see the blessing in it too? The things that you can see and understand, the beauties that others sometimes miss, the people you never would have known otherwise, the perspectives that you bring. There is strength and goodness and beauty in every person with a disability. Paul gives us Another perspective of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 when he says the church is not just the family of God, the church is also a body. And this is how that body operates. There are many parts of that body, but one body. So the eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker, and I love the seem to, that just on the surface seem to be weaker, they are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. This leads to our final truth. God calls us to special care for persons with disabilities. Special honor, they are indispensable. Now, I want to be very careful here again because we need to avoid a couple of things. One of the things that sometimes we do with persons with disabilities is we patronize them, meaning we only use them as an inspiration or a cause, and we make them heroes and sort of mythical figures that are something more than human, just to inspire, like able-bodied people or persons that are non-disabled. Here's what I mean. You have all seen a video of someone that could barely walk, and then they complete a marathon, and we do their entire journey, and at the end of that, see, like, look at this. If somebody like that can complete a marathon, what could you do? And we use it as inspiration, and we've just dehumanized that person. I think it comes out of a good heart. I think people are well-meaning when they're doing that, but we're simply using a person with a disability as an inspiration. They're not just an inspiration, they're a human being. And so we've got to be careful that we don't patronize persons with disabilities. And at the same time, we also don't want to pity them. We don't pity persons with disabilities. You don't see that attitude in Paul. Paul had a disability. He doesn't ask for pity from anybody. I don't know that people really want pity. They want friends. We're humans. We want relationships as well. We'll get to that in just a minute. But we don't want to patronize. We don't want to pity. And at the same time, we recognize and acknowledge that God wants special care for those that are vulnerable, that are disadvantaged, that are struggling under heavy burdens. Look at how Paul says this in Galatians chapter 6. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 2 through 5, Paul is going to say something that almost seems contradictory on the surface. See if you can pick it up. Galatians 6, verse 2. He says to us, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they're something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions, and then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. Get this, for each one should carry their own load. Paul, talking out of both sides of your mouth, man. In verse 2, you said we should carry each other's burdens, and now you're telling everybody they're just supposed to carry their own load. So which is it? Carry each other's burdens or carry our own load? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes to both of those things. The words themselves can maybe help us out. In verse 2, the word burden means a heavy load that would be difficult for one person to carry alone. In verse number 5, the word load is more like a backpack. And so in essence, what Paul is saying is, as much as you can, take responsibility for your own backpack. For the life stuff that you need to live, to work, to relate to others. But recognize there will be times in your life where you will have a burden, and others regularly have a burden that is too big for them to carry on their own. So help each other. Care for the vulnerable, those that are weighed down. Isn't this just what Jesus did? Jesus sought out people with heavy burdens, people with disabilities, even going to those who could not come to him, the lame, the blind, leprosy. I mean, they were social outcasts, and Jesus pursues them. It was a focus of his ministry. And when he meets them, he doesn't just deal with them and their physical need and heal them. He says things to them like, your sins are forgiven. And go and sin no more. Because he's calling them into a whole-orbed life with him. Their spiritual life, their physical life, their social circumstances. Jesus is seeking to transform all of that, the whole person, treating each person with dignity and great respect. What Jesus is doing is carrying out in real time the heart of God that has been revealed throughout the entire Bible for us. Throughout the Bible, God, we see him with a special care for the vulnerable. He gives special attention, especially throughout the Old Testament, to 4 particular groups that he calls out again and again and again. Orphans, widows, the immigrants, and the poor. God has a special heart for them. In other words, they have particularly heavy burdens that may require special care. Look, church, We live in a day where persons with disabilities are not to be patronized or pitied, but loved and cared for as family. As family. Some have heavy burdens that we can help carry. That's the call we get. You might say, okay, Jeremy, we talked about disability. I've got an idea of what that is, and I think about my family where I'm dealing with this, these 3 principles that we've got. Well, what do we do? How do we give special attention and care for persons with disabilities? And I would say that we need some more work on these. In some ways, we're just getting started with this. But let me briefly give you these 4 ways. Really, there's 8 ways, but sometimes when you're a preacher, you can say it's 4 points when you put 2 things together. So there's 8 things, but 4 things. Okay, listening and learning, kind of like what we're doing here today, trying to just grow, trying to learn, trying to just take a step towards some more knowledge and understanding. Then accessibility and inclusion. Continue to think about how do we make opportunities and gatherings like this and small groups and Bible studies and getting coffee and having meals, how do we make that more accessible and more inclusive? And then relationships and engagement. We really, want to move towards relationships and engagement, seeing the dignity, the worth of every individual, the contribution they have to make to a relationship so there's mutuality, and then opportunities for service and leadership. There is room for serving persons with disabilities that's needed, carry burdens, but more than that is relational connection, mutuality, serving with, serving together. Our denomination, the Evangelical Free Church of America, has a leadership team called the All Peoples Initiative. One area of focus for them is disability and special needs ministry. And they say this: the end goal of disability ministry is not doing ministry to those with disabilities or doing ministry for them, but doing ministry with them for the benefit of all. Ministry together, ministry with. And on that, we still have some work to do. This is a step today. And I just want to encourage you to continue to learn, continue to grow, to continue to have conversations, to engage together on this. Persons with disabilities are created in the image of God, having great worth and contribution to the family of God. Disability can be a strength, and God calls us to special care for persons with disabilities. Let me give you one final thought. I've told you before that this is my favorite all-time painting. It's by Caravaggio, and it's called The Incredulity of St. Thomas. If you've been around for a while, you're probably tired of me putting this up on the screen because I talk about it a lot. It captures the moment when Jesus meets with Thomas, one of his disciples, after the resurrection. And Thomas says that he would not believe that Jesus resurrected from the grave unless he sees the nail scars and placed his hand in Jesus' side. And so you know what Jesus does? Jesus meets Thomas in his doubts and pulls him in. He doesn't rebuke Thomas. He comes to Thomas, meets him where he's at, and says, Thomas, see the nail scars. But today, I want you to consider one other detail that's very easy to overlook. In this instance, Jesus has his resurrected body, his perfect, holy, eternal, resurrected body. The body that followers of Jesus Christ will have, because the scriptures say that when we see him, we will be like him, because we'll see him just as he is. And that body of Jesus is scarred. It has a hole in his side, and it has nail prints in his wrists. But to be whole, to be fully human, to have perfect bodies is to be scar-free, right? To be perfectly formed, to be hearing, seeing, walking, that's normal, that's good, right? Or maybe Jesus has another definition of good. Maybe it's not all about healing and normalcy the way we think of it now. Maybe in the power and plan of God, he will renew and redeem us in and with our weaknesses and our disabilities in ways that will absolutely amaze us. You take that thought with you. I'm your pastor. I don't even know all that means. I'm still thinking about it. What does that mean? But it must mean something incredibly profound. I want to introduce Jolene Philo to you. Jolene has been a part of NorthPoint for the last 5 years. She has three generations of family that are here that are a part of NorthPoint Church. And she's an author, writer. She works with our denomination on chronic illness and special needs ministry. And I've asked her to share just a little bit of her story with us today. So would you welcome Jolene up here this morning?
Thank you, Jeremy. As Jeremy said, we've been coming to NorthPoint for about 5 years. My husband and I live in Polk City with our daughter, Ann, our son-in-law, Kalen Fleck, who you may know as the custodian here, and our two of our grandchildren, Tad and Luella. I will have pictures in the back after the service for you to see of them because I know you want to. But I will also be in the back at the end of the service to talk to you if you'd like to come and ask me questions or share your disability story, whatever. But for now, I'm going to share my family story that began before the people I live with were born, with the exception of my husband. My story begins when I was 2 years old. And my father, who was 29, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. His disease progressed rather quickly at first. I cannot remember him walking, just in a wheelchair. And he was sick for a long time. He had to stop his job when he'd only been at it for about 5 years. My mother, who had a 2-year teaching degree, went back to teaching, finished her 4-year degree, and got her master's degree, all while teaching full-time, caring for 3 young kids and a husband with multiple sclerosis. She's a really remarkable woman in her own right. My dad was sick, as I said, for a long time, but my parents decided that they would do everything they could to make sure he stayed in our home while we kids were growing up, and they were successful at that. My brother, sister, and I had a slightly different childhood than many of you. We did a lot of caregiving duties. I'm not going to go into those right now. But when we were all out on our own, my dad developed diabetes, and Mom could no longer care for him in the home. And so he went into a residential facility. To give you an example of the scope of what he and Mom dealt with, Dad was 54 when he went into a nursing home, and he was the youngest person. And when he died 14 years later, he was still the youngest resident and had been there the longest. Now, when the last year my dad lived at home, my husband Hiram and I welcomed our first child into our family. His name is Alan. And shortly after he was born, he was diagnosed with a disability called tracheal esophageal fistula, a condition, I should say. What that means is that his esophagus came down from his throat and formed a blind pouch. It came up from his stomach and hooked into his trachea. He was life-flighted to the University of Nebraska Hospital in Omaha and had surgery before he was a day old. He had a quick recovery at first, but then there were a lot of complications. By the time he was 5 years old, he had had a total of 7 surgeries and many, many invasive tests and procedures, so many that I can't even count them anymore. Alan was 3 when we moved to Boone. He had his final surgery of his young childhood when he was 5 at Blank Hospital. And then he had a long period of good health and, being a normal kid. At 15, he had a final surgery at Children's Hospital in Kansas City. And we thought everything was going to be okay, except he started displaying a lot of behavioral issues. It took until he was 26 years old for him to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder that was caused by all of the early medical trauma. We were truly blessed that he was able to get into a cutting-edge trauma therapy program, and he is doing very well now. He's married. He has 2 kids in Wisconsin. I have pictures of them too, so just plan on that. And he's a farmer there. Now, our story has lots of hard bits, but it also has lots of good ones. The hardest part is perhaps the isolation that we experienced as a family affected by disability. Do you remember COVID? When you had to stay, do you remember COVID? When you had to stay home and you had to watch services online and how awful that was, and how deprived you felt, and you had to wear a mask, and you had to use hand sanitizer, and your kids were home a lot. That is the norm for many people who are living with disabilities. That's how they live now. My father could not attend church for the last 25 years of his life because of his disability and his lack of mobility. It was the norm for Hiram and I and our baby when he was little because he caught every bug that was out there. He was medically fragile. We were often rushing to the hospital, to the emergency room, or we were in the hospital for surgeries. That was hard. But there was good in that too. And the good came when the people in our churches that we attended broke through the isolation. For example, my parents' Sunday school class made a rotation where 2 people came every week and sat with Dad during the Sunday school and church hour so my mother could go to worship. They did it for years and years. A neighbor down the street, Harry Thompson, was a retired minister, and he would walk down every afternoon and visit with Dad, hear the same stories Dad had been telling over and over and over and over, and play cribbage with him, and my dad had very original and creative rules for that game. There were other visitors that came often. I can remember being a kid when George Vanderploeg and Bert Coffin and John Troba would visit. I can remember being an adult with kids of my own and calling and having Mom say that they had just visited Dad at the hospital or at the nursing home too. When we were young parents, I really, really struggled with a God who gave a little baby so much suffering. I couldn't understand why he would allow that. Well, the pastor and his wife at our little church started coming every week, and they did a Bible study with us. My husband says we studied the book of James. I cannot remember anything we studied, but I know that they came, and they helped me in my faith. Other people, when we came home after Alan's first stay in the hospital, it had been about 4 weeks. People came in and cleaned our house. They also cleaned out all the green, fuzzy, growing stuff in our refrigerator and restocked it so we didn't even have to make a grocery run. When we moved to Boone for Alan's last surgery at Blank, a couple from our church came down. They said, "Don't eat supper, we're bringing a picnic." And they brought a picnic. It was June, and we went out in the courtyard. Alan was in one of those little wagons, and we all had a picnic, and it felt wonderful. Other people sent cards. They prayed for us. They visited us in the hospital. They tended our garden that first year. They came and they tended it the first time we were gone. The second time we were gone, they harvested everything, froze it, and put it in our freezer. Amazing. As I said, that kind of isolation needs to be broken through because isolation is the norm for many families impacted by disability. There's a statistic that says 90% of people with disabilities or impacted by it are unchurched. That makes them the largest unchurched people group in the world and in your neighborhood. So what can we at NorthPoint as a whole and as individuals to break through that isolation and bring those people into fellowship with us so we can minister together? You could start with some of the things that I just described. You can think back to last week when the Stanleys spoke about how they were helped by the church when they adopted their children, because many of those same things apply. And then you can build on that. Make it even more positive and stronger. You could not just take a meal to a family. You could ask, is it okay if I stay and eat with you? Because many of those families haven't had a guest eat supper with them for a long, long time, maybe never. You could also, this one is the one that will break my heart every time. I hear from parents of kids with disabilities all the time that their children have never been invited to a birthday party. We could change that. We could start inviting kids with disabilities to birthday parties so our kids can get to know them and they can learn how to play with them and eventually to worship with them and make a huge difference. You could call ahead of time to make sure you know what to do so that child feels comfortable, but we can do that, right? We could do the same thing with play dates. Another thing, just exchange daily texts with a caregiver or someone impacted by disability. Ask how you can pray for them and tell them how they can pray for you. So you're praying together. Here's a great one. Going back to what was done for my dad, we could arrange to have people from our church go and watch the online services with people who aren't able to attend because of medical conditions and mobility issues. We can arrange to have FaceTime set up or a Zoom call set up and make that part of our men's and women's Bible studies so people, again, can participate in them in real time and fellowship together. Something that a family did or was done for a family and with a family in our church when we were in Boone, they had a young adult son named Jeff, who was severely developmentally delayed, and he had a lot of other issues, and he was very, very loud. It was hard for his parents to find anyone to watch their son in the evening so they could go to community group. Do you know what their community group did? They said, we'll come to you. Every single time we'll come to your house. We'll take turns bringing the food so that we can all fellowship together. An extra bonus of that was that Jeff gained a whole circle of adult friends who knew him and loved him and interacted with him. I would also invite you to think about volunteering or donating to the Wonderfully Made Family Camp that is held in June at Hidden Acres. We serve from 23 to 40 families, depending on how much funding we have and how many volunteers we can get. And we provide a camp experience with those families that includes their parents, it includes the typical siblings, and it includes the kids with disabilities and special needs. Many of those kids, as the camp has gone on, and many of those families have come back not to be be served at the camp, but to serve the new campers that are coming. And finally, the thing we all should be doing is praying for and with our friends who have disabilities, not just when the crisis hits, but over the long haul. Because this is their life, and it will be with them, for most of them, all of their life.